lateness. I forgot to bring my handouts for you all, so I just ran back to get those. But thank you for joining us in this session, or joining me. Sound like I have multiple personalities there. I don't. You'll be rest assured to know. But I'm really pleased to see you all here, and I hope we're going to have a great session. I hope we'll have a lot of great discussion and dialogue. And I will certainly be encouraging all of you to take a very active role in that. Hopefully we'll have a lot of time for question and answer, and to also hear some of your experiences related to this particular topic of how we can collaborate with faith networks for the purpose of family-based care. So for those of you who I haven't had the privilege of meeting in person before, my name is Rebecca Nhep, and I am the Senior Technical Advisor for the Better Care Network. And the Better Care Network is a network, as the name suggests, that was set up in 2003, primarily by UNICEF and by divisions within the US government who relate to vulnerable children, and also by Save the Children. And it was established to really be the information hub, look at the knowledge and research agenda of the care sector, and also as a convening platform for collaboration at the global level around all things related to children's care. Now, in this particular session, what we're going to be doing is looking at exploring how faith-based networks play a role, and what kind of role they play in ensuring that all children can access family-based care. And we're going to look at this in terms of the roles that churches can play, what they can do, how do we actually tap into those networks, how do we mobilize those networks. But this is looking at it from multiple angles. So we're not just looking here at family-based alternative care, but we'll also be looking at this from the perspective of how do we collaborate with faith networks for family strengthening and family preservation, because obviously we know that is a huge component of ensuring that all children can grow up in safe and nurturing families. Once we've had a little bit of a look at some of the roles that the church is really well positioned to place, we're going to then look at some strategies of how we can actually foster that collaboration. And I want to explore this with you from two particular angles. So we're going to look at it in terms of from the inside out. If you're located within a church or a church network, how do we actually activate and mobilize our churches, individual churches or networks of churches, to actually take up this agenda and collaborate with external actors for the purpose of ensuring children can access family-based care? And then we're going to look at it from the outside-in perspective. How do organisations or actors who sit outside of the church collaborate with the church? How can they reach in and tap into the unique strengths and positioning of the church in order to ensure that the church can play a role in children being able to grow up in families? At the end of that is when we'll turn to question and answer, thoughts from the floor, and we'll hopefully seek some of your experiences to feed into the mix as well. So we're going to start with looking at the important role that faith networks play in family-based care for children. And I think it's an important starting point to recognise that faith-based networks already play a role in supporting disadvantaged communities and disadvantaged members in our communities. And the role that we play there is quite long-standing. You know, we can look way, way, way back in history, but even, in the early 2000s, in 2002, the then president of the World Bank released a report acknowledging that half of the work being done in education and in health in sub-Saharan Africa was being done by the church. 2 years later, another report was released by the World Bank, which identified that 20% of HIV-related interventions in that same region were being delivered by faith-based organisations and actors. So I think it's important to start by recognising that faith-based networks have a huge role to play, but faith-based networks already play a huge role. We are not an isolated space or sector to these issues that need to be awoken per se in its entirety. We are a sector and a space and a church that has already been deeply engaged in issues of providing services and support to marginalised populations in our communities and beyond. And I think that there are two underpinning factors that we can look at that help us to understand why collaborating with faith-based actors makes sense, why it is strategic, and why it is likely, and evidence from history shows that it is, going to be something that is highly impacting in terms of children's care. And in my opinion, it's important to understand these so we understand that the church's role is enduring. It is going to continue. So it's a matter of tapping into those strengths rather than actually trying to develop them. And the two reasons that I think are underpinning to this, the first one is imperative. The church has a biblical imperative to care and to serve. And in particular, to care for and to serve vulnerable members of our communities and our societies. And we know that the Bible names specific categories of vulnerable persons, including migrants, asylum seekers, dare we say the word, refugees, marginalised populations or ethnic groups. The Bible often talks about the Levite as an example of that, the poor, the orphan, and the widow. And what's important to understand is that these groups are not randomly chosen. There's actually a common thread to all of these groups of people who are vulnerable. And it is that in the time that the scriptures were written, in the socio-political context of those times, these were all groups of people who shared one common factor, and that is that they were out without the provision and the protection that was afforded to people with legal rights to inheritance. And your right to inheritance was actually the key to being protected legally and socially and in terms of provision. And all of those categories of people were outside of those rights or were in a vicarious position of having those rights denied to them. And as a result of that, they are vulnerable. And as a result of that recognition, the church is called to extend special protection to them, to care for them, to serve them, and to defend those rights that are at risk of being violated. We can see these categories of people being specifically acknowledged in lots of different passages of Scripture. But I want to draw your attention to one, and that is in Deuteronomy 14:29. And it says, speaking of leaving a portion of our tithes aside as a provision for these vulnerable people who are outside of a framework where provision is going to naturally flow to them. And it says, lay it up within thy gates, and the Levite, because he has no portion of inheritance with you, the sojourner and the fatherless and the widow that are within your gates shall come and shall eat and shall be satisfied. Now, there are lots of other scriptures we could point to that mention these same groups of people and mention our obligation as Christians and as a church to defend and provide support to them. James 1:27 is basically our pin-up verse, right, as a sector, as a group that is really looking at this issue of vulnerable children in particular. But when we look at that scripture, it is actually a scripture it doesn't endorse taking children outside of families. It doesn't endorse removing children from the care of their parents or usurping the role of families in the life of the child and caring for them in orphanages or other types of residential or institutional care. Now, that's not to say that in some cases there isn't a need for a child to be removed from a family or found outside of a family for a range of reasons and in need of alternative care. But what we need to understand is this verse and all the other verses in Scripture that talk about orphaned children. It is a narrative that surrounds that word orphan or orphanhood. The narrative of the Bible is actually one of family strengthening. It is actually one of family-based care. These scriptures are not an endorsement to remove children from families and care for them in non-family-based settings. And we can see that in most of the scriptures where orphans or fatherless children are mentioned, they are mentioned in the context of a widow. In this scripture, that's the case in James 1:27, and it's the case in many, many other scriptures as well. And I think one thing that in some parts of the world, the church has understood these to be two groups of people, orphans and widows. And we've actually missed the connection between them. This is a widowed woman and her fatherless children. This is a vulnerable family unit that we are being called to defend and protect. But when we miss that link, what we often do is have a widow's program and then an orphanage or an orphans program. And we miss the narrative surrounding the vulnerability of orphans and widows as a narrative of family preservation, family strengthening, and family protection. We need to recognize that again, like we said earlier with all those categories of people, the vulnerability of a widow-headed family stems from the fact that in a patriarchal society, such as what was in place at the time of the writing of these scriptures, that the protection and the provision flowed through the father's line. And when the father was no longer present, when the father had died, that widow and her children were now vulnerable of losing access to their inheritance, to their provision, and to their land and their protection. And that is the basis of their vulnerability. And it is those rights that the scripture is calling us to defend. And in our modern day narratives, that is a mandate for family preservation. It is a mandate for protecting not just the orphan, but protecting the mother, the widow, protecting the vulnerable family unit. We have a biblical imperative to protect families, to ensure children can be raised in family-based care. The second underpinning principle is the positioning of the church. The church, by its very nature, is part of the grassroots fabric of society and communities in which these individual churches are found. And at that grassroots level, the church plays a number of important and normative roles. The church plays a role in community life of providing spiritual and moral guidance. You know, often churches, when they're really integrated in their communities, they set the moral and the spiritual temperature of the whole community. They are at the forefront of providing that guidance, of helping the community interpret social trends and new things that come about within a moral and spiritual framework. They are at the forefront of shaping norms and values of society and giving guidance around that. The church also plays a role in community of awakening collective conscience to social issues. Like the prophets of the old days, the church is the one that stands up and calls to attention the issues of injustice in our communities and mobilizes and rallies people to respond out of that biblical imperative that we talked about earlier. The church also naturally builds social capital. It wraps people into social networks, relationships that are marked by trust and reciprocity, and through those social networks, by increasing what we call social density of networks, people can begin to access informal social support. I'm going to talk more about that particular issue in a moment. The church is also plays a natural and normative role in mobilizing people to serve. Because as Christians and as the church, we have an imperative to serve. It flows out of who we are, from our pulpits, from our programs, from our interaction with people. We are constantly leading them to see the plight of others, and we are mobilizing them to serve, both inside the church and outside of the walls of the church. And we enable service as churches by actually creating opportunities for service and linking individuals, their assets, their skills, their talents to those opportunities. And in a moment, we're going to watch a video, and you'll see in that video that it's based on a piece of research that shows the rates of volunteering or service in Christian communities is much higher than in secular communities. And one of the reasons they point to is because the role of the church plays in actually connecting people to opportunities to serve, making it easier for them. The church also connects needs to resources. Churches are relational. We get to know people. We know who comes in and out of our churches. You know, even the bigger churches have structures and small groups and different frameworks that allow us to get to know these families. We know their strengths. We know what's happening to them in their times of need. We can connect one family's strengths and resources to another family in a time of crisis in order to provide support. We rally people around the plight of others within our church communities to provide that practical support that wraps a family in a protective framework and network. And this is what we call informal social support. So I want us to quickly have a look at a video, and this comes from a community in the inner city of Sydney, but I think there's a lot of relevant learning in terms of the role that churches play in this whole area of social networks and social support that we're going to explore a little bit more in a moment.
Petersham is an increasingly wealthy inner-city suburb of Sydney. This used to be a working-class neighbourhood, but the housing boom has seen an influx of well-heeled professionals. Still, here you'll find plenty of people struggling to get by. Family breakdown, social isolation, mental health issues and joblessness can all conspire to make life particularly bleak. But at All Saints, the door is always open. Locals can share lunch at the weekly barbecue, pick up a freezer meal, or fill a shopping bag with discounted groceries. They're welcomed, supported, and encouraged. Researchers have studied the ways that churches and individual believers serve their communities and found some surprising results.
People who are embedded in a religious community are much more likely to be engaged in civic activity. Some of that is inside their religious community, Christians who are doing things in their churches, but much of it extends beyond it. They are more likely to vote. They're more likely to get involved in charities. They're more likely to volunteer in various settings, from hospitals to schools. So religion may motivate people to do that, but it also gives them what some scholars have called social capital, a combination of networks and other resources that make it easier for them to participate.
The types of questions that are asked in survey research about the kinds of things that people do, are you more likely to give blood? Are you more likely to work in a soup kitchen? Are you likely to get up out of your seat to give someone else a seat on the bus or in public transportation? In some ways, these things are very small items, but they are reflective of a broader perspective. And in those instances, higher levels of religiosity, even controlling for all the other factors such as education or income or gender, even geographical location, let's say, in the United States, all those things taken into account, it's still true that religious people tend to exhibit these kinds of behaviors at a much higher level, frequently a statistically significant higher level than those who are lower in religiosity.
Even in supposedly post-Christian Australia, the data points in the same direction. The religious bump seems real. People who regularly attend religious services are more likely to volunteer than people who say they're not religious, and to do more hours of volunteering. And while most Aussies give money to charity, on average, regular churchgoers give significantly more each year.
This isn't to say Christians are better people than non-Christians, but as the writer C.S. Lewis once said, it seems like they are better than they would be without their Christianity. Usually.
It is perfectly possible, I'm afraid, to go to a church and go, help, and have them go, I'm sorry, we're busy with the flower arranging. But it doesn't always happen like that. It's observable that Christians are particularly drawn towards service in those situations where things really can't be made better, where the best you can do is keep suffering company. Applying love in small, individual, practical ways. There is no possible PR for these things, but they push the world gently but persistently towards being a kinder and less wrecked place than it would be otherwise.
Plenty of people are wary of religious types, and that's understandable. But if you can trust the stats and the history, then maybe a bunch of Christians moving into your neighbourhood might not be such a bad thing after all.
If you're looking for the significance of a community which believes in human dignity, which believes in, yes, the salvation of the soul, which believes in, the lordship of Jesus Christ, but equally who believes that we want to be judged not just on our beliefs as Christians, but on our service to the whole community, people of all faiths or none, then look for what we are doing. Look for the life of the church in its service to its community, not just in who's pushing the doors open on a Sunday morning. You may miss what's actually happening in the life of a church committed to engagement.
You can start to already see some of the implications of this for family-based care. The research, most of our individual experiences will all point in the same direction and say that Christian communities, i.e. churches, are predisposed because of our theology, because of how our churches mobilize us to serve others, to help others, to extend to others this concept of informal social support. And when we think about how faith networks can ensure that children have access to family-based care, often our mind will first and foremost go to programs. And we'll be thinking about what kind of programs our churches can run or get involved in, whether that's foster care or a domestic adoption or other family and child welfare types of programs. And then these programs are incredibly important. We need those types of services for children and their families. But not all churches are going to be in a position, not going to be in the best position to actually run those types of services. But all churches are in a good and unique position to provide to vulnerable families and vulnerable children informal social support. And this is one of the key assets that we can tap into the church to activate and to enable collaboration between the church and other service providers and vulnerable families and children in our community, is tapping into this network of informal social support. So let's explore that concept a little bit more. If we were to define it, informal social support is unpaid help or support provided to any individual or group outside of the formal service system. And as early as 1967, from what I can find, I'm sure there might be research that predates that, but there has been research that specifically looked into the social aspects of church and concluded that churches act as surrogate families to isolated individuals and families, to single parent-headed households, to vulnerable family units, and provide invaluable social support that has been shown to have a range of positive benefits, including improving morbidity. We live longer when we live in a supported community, including a protective factor against suicide and suicidal ideation, depression, isolation, and other mental health issues. You're right. Being part of a church and accessing that informal social support also gives people a sense of belonging, of connection, of worth, of value, and of importance. All of those psychosocial aspects of, breaking down things like such as poverty that aren't just about economics and material aspects, but are also about what happens when that is internalized. Informal social support breaks down some of those things and makes people feel connected and worth and of value. It also, therefore, reduces feelings of hopelessness. It builds resilience in people. It affirms positive coping mechanisms in the face of struggles or crisis situations. Informal social support is instrumental in meeting practical needs, including for resources, including connecting isolated individuals to services, and including assistance for child rearing. Informal social support through the church provides a safety net for people who are living in poverty, particularly in resource-stricken environments. It mobilises community responses in response to families in crisis. So when families face those crises that can't be anticipated, sickness, death of a loved one or a parent, the informal social support provided by churches actually mobilises around those families in those times and enables them to cope, enables them to continue to play the caregiving role that they are playing for their children, and it prevents family breakdown. The research on informal social support provided by the church to low-income mothers in situations where there were weak social safety nets in the public sector showed that it offered protection from psychosocial distress, from economic hardship, from poor parenting practices, and poor child outcomes. The type of informal social support that comes from the church is so well positioned to offer critical lifelines to at-risk families, to vulnerable children, and to vulnerable families who otherwise might face an increased risk of breakdown and relinquishment of children. It is a critical part of helping families cope. And it's important to understand that it's an interplay of two factors when we think about informal support. It's an interplay of support that is actually received and support that is perceived. And that's a really important thing to understand, because regardless of how frequently a vulnerable family may or may not access actual informal support, the knowledge that it will be available to them should they face a situation that exceeds their own coping mechanisms is actually a huge part of the puzzle. It prevents families from looking for other types of social safety nets, such as orphanages, because they know that they have a defence on their side. They know that there is a net that will catch them. There is a community that will rally behind them and support them should they face a situation that they're unable to resolve with their own means and accords. In other words, it's a currency of hope. And hope enables families to persevere even when they're facing challenges, because they know that somebody else will have their back and they won't be alone. And in my work, and probably many of you can think about situations in your own work or personal lives in churches that are similar, but I can't tell you how many times I came across that issue, particularly in work reintegrating children out of institutions back into families, because so many of these families place their children in the first place because they are using these orphanages as safety nets. In the deficit of having those social safety nets in place in a public system, that is what they're using orphanages for. Because they don't know that if they face one little crisis in their family, they don't know how they will cope. They have no reserves, they have no savings, they are often already in debt, and so in their minds they think the orphanage is going to be able to sustain support for my children no matter what I face, no matter whether our family is hit with illness or drought or flooding that affects our farming or whatever it might be. Our children will be cared for. Our children will be fed, they will be clothed, and they will receive shelter. So orphanages are becoming a social safety net that families are using to avert crisis situations that they are unable to independently cope with. But what about if instead of institutions being a social safety net, what about if the church played that very role? What about if it was the church that was mobilized around these families to step up and be both the informal social support that they need, that they actually receive in a time of crisis, but the perceived informal social support that they can depend upon, that gives them that hope, that gives them that courage to be able to persevere and continue to provide support and care for their own children. And I think that this is one of the critical things that we need to tap into, that we need to activate in terms of mobilizing the church around family-based care. And it's about bringing people into a community. It's about instilling in them that sense of hope. And the other thing that they found that informal social support does for vulnerable families, it's not only about what they can receive, it's also what they can give. As that video showed, when you're involved in a community like a church, it gives you opportunities to serve. And in many times, these families may have been at the receiving end for a very long time. And that can create all sorts of issues that we know of dependence, of feeling inferior, particularly as we internalize those aspects of poverty. But church communities give people a way to give back within their means. It may be by using their time or their energy and not necessarily material resources. But when we actually enable these families to give back to other families and to contribute through service, we also build in these families a sense of hope, a sense of purpose, a sense of contribution, of being worth something. And that is also a critical factor in building family resilience. So informal social support is one of our key assets as a church. It is one of the key things we can tap into to mobilise the church around family-based care. Another thing I want to look at, another role that I believe the church can play is well positioned to play as a grassroots community organisation, is around engaging in and leading community-led development processes. Now, when we think about preventing family separation or child institutionalisation or whichever way you want to look at it, we need to understand what the drivers are. What is actually causing those issues in families? What is creating situations where separation becomes the outcome? And in many times, it is issues around poverty. It is issues around resources. Even in times when you see officials or child protection authorities removing children in many of these contexts, oftentimes it's because the well-being concerns have hit such a high threshold, but it's not actually necessarily a risk of abuse or anything like that. It's more looking at the inability of these families to meet these children's needs. And so it can often be education, as we know. In communities where the education quality is quite low, that is another really common driver of separation or child institutionalisation. It can also be lack of jobs in communities that forces parents to migrate and leave their children behind or leave their children without adequate care. And sometimes those migration processes in many countries, particularly countries I've worked in Asia, are driven by climate change related issues, erratic rainfall, erratic seasons that mean that their farming mechanisms can no longer provide for their family in the way that they used to. And that is leading to massive increases in rates of migration out of rural communities, but also out of the country into neighbouring countries. And that creates a situation of family separation and child vulnerability. All of these issues that are drivers of family breakdown and separation are issues that to some extent can be addressed or mitigated through grassroots community development processes. And the church, being a part of grassroots community, is actually really well placed to lead some of those processes. And this has been an aspect of work that I've been involved in Cambodia for 2 decades now, in mobilising churches to actually lead and facilitate community development processes in their local communities. And what they do is they reach out to the leaders of the community, to all the different people in the community, they rally them together, they lead them through a process of casting vision, the whole community casting vision for the community, identifying what their primary goals are, what their priorities are, mapping their own assets and resources, and learning that if they use those assets and resources together, collectively, they're actually able to address many of the obstacles that create vulnerability at the family and at the child level. And then they develop plans, they work together to actually utilise their assets to overcome the obstacles and to achieve the vision that they have cast collectively as a community. And we are seeing these programs run by local, little tiny rural local churches in rural Cambodia start to really change these communities. We are seeing parents who've migrated to Thailand to work in illegal logging coming back because these churches have actually worked together with the community, with the government, and tapping into the resources of churches in Australia and other countries to provide support. They've been able to solve issues such as water insecurity, food insecurity, income insecurity. That enables parents to come back. And when they come back, they're present with their children. They're able to raise their children. And we have seen children being returned from orphanages at the initiative of the parents who go back to get their children because now they have a means. They have a way to meet their own children's needs. And these programs are all being run by local churches. So I want to show you quickly a video that just gives you an example of what this is and just how low-key, how grassroots it is, but what an impact it's making for families in communities.
ក្រុមជំនុំមានឥទ្ធិពលដល់សហគមន៍គឺក្រុមជំនុំបានធ្វើដោយចិត្តស្មោះអត់មានគិតពីកម្រៃត្រឡប់មកវិញទេបានដូរផ្លាស់នៃការរស់នៅជីវភាពរបស់គាត់មានឥទ្ធិពលដល់រដ្ឋអំណាចមូលដ្ឋានដែរ 80% ជាកសិករប្រកបមុខរបរជាសម្បងហ្នឹងធ្វើស្រែធ្វើចម្ការធ្វើស្រែហ្នឹងហើយនៅតំបន់នេះខ្វះខាតទឹកហើយប្រជាជនក្រីក្រភាគច្រើនបាទសូម្បីតែយើងធ្វើស្រែឬក៏យើងចង់ដាំដំណាំអីវាបញ្ហាខ្វះខាតទឹកក៏ស្រែមិនចេញខ្ញុំតែងតែមានសំណើទៅរដ្ឋាភិបាលតែអត់ទទួលបាន មុនដំបូងទៅថាអត់មានអីសង្ឃឹមបាទមិនថារដ្ឋាភិបាលលោកអត់មានលទ្ធភាពទេលោកអត់លទ្ធភាពប៉ុន្តែវាច្រើនពេកទៅមិនងាយជួយគាត់បានអានេះការពិតហើយដល់ពេលដែលយើងបានចោះជួយនឹងគាត់អន់ណាគាត់ថាមានតែក្រុមជំនុំទេដែលអាចមកជួយគាត់ផ្ទាល់តែម្ដងហ្នឹងហើយគាត់សប្បាយចិត្ត បានជួយជាប្រពន្ធជួយជារៀងអាងចិញ្ចឹមត្រីជាសួនដំណាំគ្រាប់ដំណាំអីគ្រូពេទ្យមកជួយណែនាំបង្រៀនពិនិត្យសុខភាពនេះជាការប្រសើរសម្រាប់ប្រជាជនក្នុងសហគមន៍នេះចំពោះទទួលបានអំណោយស្រះនេះវាជាដូចថាជាអំណោយមួយយ៉ាងថ្លៃថ្លាសម្រាប់ប្រជាជនក្នុងសហគមន៍នេះពេលដែលយើងបានជួយស្រះទឹកហ្នឹងគឺមានន័យថាគាត់គឺអមហាសានអហើយបាទលោកគ្រូខុសនឹងឲ្យអាងត្រីនឹងខ្ញុំចាំត្រីហងដាំបន្លែផងដែលអាច
ដោះស្រាយក្នុងជីវភាពគ្រួសារខ្ញុំបានគ្រប់គ្រាន់ចែកចាយបងប្អូនយើងហូបទៀតជាជនសប្បាយចិត្តលោកឃើញស្រាប់ការចូលរួមការបរិច្ចាគដីជុំវិញស្រះនេះមិនតិចម៉ែត្រទេគាត់បរិច្ចាគដោយសារគាត់សប្បាយចិត្តខាងក្រុមព្រះនឹងមកជួយផ្សព្វផ្សាយអញ្ចឹងនឹងជួយផ្គត់ផ្គង់អាងផ្គត់ផ្គង់អីចឹងយើងចេះមានលទ្ធភាពចេះធ្វើតាមគាត់ចឹងតិចទៅហើយតាផ្លែមែនតើមកផ្លែដល់បែបនេះមកចំពោះប្រជាជនក្នុងសហគមន៍គេភ្ញាក់ផ្អើលដែរដូចថាគេឃើញក្រុមជំនុំគ្រីស្ទានហ្នឹងចុះទៅជួយផ្ទាល់គាត់មើលឃើញថាព្រះយេស៊ូវគឺព្រះដែលជួយភាពអស្ចារ្យរបស់ព្រះគឺជួយបាទល្អកូនលោកគ្រូដែរបានឲ្យត្រីនេះល្អមើលហើយនឹងល្អហូបទៀតជាការងារគាត់បានឧបត្ថម្ភឲ្យយើងខ្ញុំនឹងដើម្បីសហគមន៍យើងខ្ញុំមានទឹកប្រើប្រាស់ដល់ថ្ងៃមុខហ្នឹងណាការពីមុនមកការគ្រប់គ្រងពីរដ្ឋអំណាចគឺអត់សូវមានទេប៉ុន្តែដល់ឥឡូវនេះគឺការគ្រប់គ្រងពីរដ្ឋអំណាចគឺមានចាប់ពីមូលដ្ឋានទៅដល់ថ្នាក់លើហើយគាត់រហូតទៅដល់គាត់ផ្ដាំផ្ញើថាគាត់ការពារគ្រប់គ្រងកិច្ចការរបស់ក្រុមជំនុំទាំងអស់គ្រប់កលៈទេសៈណាយ៉ាងទៀតគាត់ប្រកាសក្នុងកម្មវិធីនោះថាគាត់លើកដង្វាយគាត់ 20% ប្រាក់ខែគាត់ដើម្បីជួយដល់ក្រុមជំនុំរបស់យើងដែរគ្រូសាខ្ញុំថាចង់បានទៅវិហារទៅ
Can you hear the hope in their voices? I think that is one of the things that impresses me and touches me the most about that work, because I know these people, I know these communities. And when you would walk into those communities before the church took that role, there was no hope. People would say to you, I remember the first training we had, and we had the permaculture trainer come, and the community stood there with their arms crossed, and they said, before you say anything, you tell us how we can do whatever it is you're going to say we should do with one little tiny bucket of water, because that's all we have. And they basically said to us, go home. There is nothing that can be done about this community. We are hopeless. We cannot change anything. They're a Buddhist culture. They believe in karma. And they would say, we were born this way, we will die this way. There is nothing we can do to change our circumstances. And today they have hope. And who brought that hope? The church. The church brought to them hope. And hope, sometimes we think about the economics of family strengthening, but I just want to tell you, do not underestimate the power of hope. When someone has hope, they have the tenacity to keep fighting. They have the tenacity to try something new. They have the tenacity to actually pick themselves back up again when something doesn't work and say, I'm going to try it again. And when they are successful, their sense of self-worth and self-esteem is built. And that continues to feed into that positive cycle of hope. And so many times we've seen resources thrown into these communities, but without a process that actually builds hope. And that is what the church can do. Because at the same time as these volunteers are meeting with families, they are affirming their worth. They are affirming their dignity. They are affirming the image of God in every single one of them. And I can tell you that I believe that has been a more critical component of those family strengthening programs than the resources or the little bits of money that have been contributed towards those projects. Because it is the hope that tells a mother that she can continue fighting for her child and not have to give her child up to an orphanage because she faces poverty. Don't underestimate the hope that our local churches bring to these families and the role that that plays in strengthening them and enabling them to provide family-based care for their children. This is just one example of how a church has been mobilised. This is a network now of around, I think the network is around about 6,000 people strong, spread across around 120 little tiny rural churches all throughout that province of Cambodia. And every single one of those churches is running a community development program that looks just like that. And we are seeing the same results and statistics time and time again of families coming back together, of children coming back from orphanages, of families taking in other children that need care because they have the means and they have the hope. And that is the role of the local church. One of the other roles that the church can play is mobilising. So I'm just going to keep my eye on time. Is mobilising families to actually provide family-based care. And we know that this is one of the roles that we can play. Now, the church, doesn't need to run the foster care program. It doesn't need to run the adoption program per se. But the other ways that churches are uniquely positioned is that we have access to networks of families. What is a church made up of? If it is not made up of families, biological families, created families, communities of people who act like families. And we can provide family-based care when we mobilize, when we enable service providers to tap into our networks of families. This is a major asset that we have as the church. We don't need to be the service provider per se, but we can collaborate by linking service providers to these networks of families that as churches we have activated, we have mobilized, we have called them, we have built into their DNA that biblical imperative that we spoke about earlier. And we can provide families for children who do legitimately require family-based care. And there are so many programs operating around the world, and I'm hoping there's going to be some of you in the room who have experience with this and can share some examples as well of how churches are playing that supportive role to family-based care service providers. I know in the US there's examples of this. In South Africa I'm hearing some examples of this, of where churches are first and foremost awakening families to the plight and the needs of children in their community who need foster care or who need adoption so that they can have permanent families. They are then putting on information nights to bring the families who are interested together and raise awareness and give them more information about what it would require. They are then linking those interested families with service providers who can go through that professional process of vetting and of screening and matching families to children who have specific needs and doing all of that more technical work. And then these churches are creating wraparound communities where they're then identifying 3 or 4 other families from within the church who can be the support network for the one family that actually does take a child into their home and provide that family-based care. And we are seeing this type of approach, this role that the church can play is to augment and support the services, the foster care and the adoption services, because they don't have access to the families. That's what they struggle with. We heard that this morning on the platform from Home for Good. They don't have access to the families, but we do. That's what we are. And so that is one of the most significant ways, again, that we as the church can collaborate to ensure that children access family-based care. I know even in my own church in Australia, we have started doing this, and I was one of the first to pilot it with them. We've got a family who took a sibling group in of 3 children, and we're one of the families that provide respite care. So once a month, those kids all come and hang out at our place for a couple of nights and become part of our family. There's other families that are providing resources. There's other families that help provide meals. There's other families that help transport these kids to activities because it exceeds the capacity of the foster family. But together, as a church, we can create networks of families who enable family-based care to become possible for children. So these are some of the ways that the church, some of the roles that the church can play in ensuring that children have access to family-based care. These are some of the things we can collaborate with the church and activate the church to collaborate externally in order to make that happen. And so now I just want to, in the last part of today, is look at how we actually do that strategically. If we were to activate our church from the inside out, what are some of the strategies or some of the tips? And I just want to briefly share a few with you. And these are particularly coming from some of our experiences in having done that, particularly in Australia with the Australian Christian Churches Network. We spent quite a number of years in activating that particular church network around family-based care and understanding the importance of it and mobilising them towards action. And I think one of the first things we found that was really helpful was to actually awaken the church to the biblical mandate. Now, most of our churches, they understood that there was, churches serve, churches help vulnerable people, but they didn't necessarily understand the church's role to support families. The church's mandate, not just to support the orphan, but to support the vulnerable family. And so we use theological frameworks to actually really ground this in the church's theology and understanding of what the biblical imperative is and what it's requiring of us as believers. We developed a whole framework for child rights that was biblically based, and I'll be sharing some of that tonight in the plenary. But we did all of that to really awaken the church to the biblical mandate. The second thing that we really looked at is identifying and empowering champions. And we were talking about this over lunch. Better than trying to be everything to everybody is to actually try to identify champions from within churches, from within networks of churches. Who are the people who have platforms, who have status, who have all of the opportunities to take this message forward? Who are the thought leaders? Who are the influencers? And better than trying to carry the message ourselves is to try to put that message in their hands. Try to equip them, build a passion, build a momentum in them that they will carry forward onto every platform they stand in, into every church that they speak at, to every conference that they are presenting at, that they will carry that passion with them. Identifying those internal champions. And the work we did in the ACC in Australia, we found that that was actually critical to ensuring that the narrative, that the dialogue around children and vulnerable children and families was maintained. Because what didn't work was to hit at it every now and again and then it dissipated. And the conversation dropped off the radar. And then you'd come at it again and it'd drop off the radar. We needed those internal champions to keep the conversation going. Because when the conversation was constant and people are hearing about it from all different angles in all different spaces, all of a sudden people started to wake up to this need to be involved in a movement to mobilize the church around family-based care. So identifying and empowering champions, and for us to play a supportive role to them. What I found was that they need to know that you've got their back. They need to know that you're going to arm them with accurate information. They need to know that they can come to you to ask questions, because if they're going to stand on a platform and promote this, they don't want to look silly. They don't want to be embarrassed, and they're not necessarily going to have the time to dig deep into all the information in the way that you or I might. So we need to be that resource to them so that they can stand on the stages that they already stand on and talk about God's heart for the vulnerable family. Another thing we found to be really helpful is to pilot something really small. You've got to turn this conversation into action. People learn primarily from what they see, not from what they hear in abstract terms. And so turning it into something tangible, but start really small. You know, it could just be an information night. It could be an awareness raising session. It could be anything, but turn it into action and allow that action to build its own momentum. Mobilize those early adopters, those eager volunteers in the church who really want to do something, who've already grabbed hold of this. Mobilize them around some kind of small, tangible pilot, and then take that learning back to the leadership of the church and show them what it's done. And what I found they're interested in is not only what it has done in terms of the lives of vulnerable children and families, but what has it done for the church? Because churches are interested in volunteering. They're interested in seeing their people mobilized around causes. And so bringing that kind of information back to the leadership was also quite important in terms of mobilizing the church from the inside out. Once you've piloted something, then you can scale it. Now you can make it bigger. Now you can take it bigger because you've been able to test something at a small level. And that's when you can mobilize your volunteers more broadly. One thing that's helpful with mobilizing volunteers is using a simple asset mapping approach, where you map the assets of your volunteers, their passions, their skills, their hearts to these external opportunities, because you're more likely to sustain volunteer action if you're actually linking them directly to what they're already passionate about, than whether or not you come up with something separate and you're trying to connect people and they'll do it out of obligation, but that's very, very difficult to sustain. So a very simple church-based mapping exercise is actually a really great tool in them being able to sustain momentum by mapping assets to opportunities. One thing that cannot be undervalued is learning. We need to keep learning. We need to keep seeking feedback, both from within our church, but also from those that we are serving. So if you're doing this in a community where you're actually reaching out to vulnerable families in your own context versus sort of supporting things that are overseas, we need to be seeking that feedback from families. They need to have a voice in this as well, in telling us what is and what isn't working, what kind of support is really going to help them and what kind of support is not necessarily as helpful. Keep learning and have a posture of learning so that we can keep improving what we are doing in supporting these families. And then share the stories. Churches love videos. Share the stories, share the heart, let them see the impact, let them vicariously see it in their lives, just like you did in those families in Cambodia. Let them see it in their eyes, let them see the hope, let them see the outcomes, share the stories. Collect those stories and share them widely. It helps with momentum, it helps to build it, and it helps to sustain it. And the other thing that I think is really key, and I think this is an area where maybe it's just the Western church, but I just don't think we've fully got this yet. And that is making church inclusive. Our churches have to be safe spaces for marginalised and vulnerable people. And oftentimes I hear people say, whether it's people with disabilities or people with mental health issues or people who have autism or different things like that, when they come, we'll make adaptations. If you wait until they come, they will never come. Because you've not given them permission. You've not given them an invitation to come. If we want to be involved in the lives of marginalised people, our churches have to be safe and inclusive spaces. That means being very intentional about making adaptations to the way we operate, the way our services are structured, so that those people know implicitly that they are welcome here. We need to do a lot of work around this whole issue of inclusion. And often we don't know how we are exclusive because we may be in a position of privilege. And that puts blinders on our eyes. We need to be in dialogue with these communities, with these different people in our communities, with marginalised people. We need to ask them with humility, what are the barriers to you feeling safe and accepted in our church? What is it about the way we structure ourselves or run services or whatever it might be that actually makes you feel uncomfortable and not welcome? And we need to be ready and willing to change those things so that our churches are not just inclusive for those who are like us, but they are inclusive for people who are marginalised in broader community, because we can't envelope them in those supportive networks if they don't first and foremost feel welcome and feel safe in our church spaces. So that whole issue of looking at inclusion is really important. And then once we have done that, tap into that whole issue of informal social support. It happens naturally in churches, but the more we're cognizant of its power, the more we can be intentional about linking vulnerable families into the right supportive networks inside of the church so they'll benefit fully from those benefits we saw of informal social support in an organic way. And that's really critical. We don't want to turn this into programs inside the church. The power of informal social support is harnessed when it's organic, when it's part of being part of those networks, not when we turn it into programs or into services within the church. It has to be organic relationships and networks. So there's some of the keys I've seen in how we mobilise a church. Turning it the other way. If we're looking at it from tapping into the church's strengths from the outside, some of the things that I think have been helpful in what I've observed and things I've been involved in is mapping the faith networks. If we're working in a community and we are a service provider, or if you're working with government or whatever vantage point it might be, and you want to tap into and collaborate with the church, map the faith-based networks. Who's doing what? Where are they located? What are their unique giftings and talents and resources that can be tapped into for the purpose of activating church communities around family-based care? Know where people are and what they're doing so that you can connect the dots when you have families that need that support. And then connect with those faith leaders. Reach out, develop relationships, meet with them. So sit down and talk to them, share your vision with them, make them aware of the needs of families in the community. The more tangible and real and imminent it is in terms of in their own community, the more impacting it's going to be when you share those stories with faith leaders. Affirm when you meet with them the strengths of the church, just exactly what it is the church can offer. So many churches are actually unaware of just how powerful informal social support is in the lives of these families. Help them to understand what an amazing asset and resource that is for families in their community. So connecting with faith leaders, including faith actors. I am a Christian. I've been a Christian for a long, long time, but I've also worked a lot in the secular space around child protection and care. And in so many times I see the Christian community, the faith community is excluded from forums, from conferences, from dialogues, from roundtables, from high-level events. It's like because we're faith actors, we're not considered child protection actors at the same time somehow. We have to become much more inclusive of crossing those different sectors and divide and including faith actors in conversations. So in whatever opportunities you may have, whether it's in a professional sense or in a government sense or whatever, to make sure we are intentionally in every space and conversation we're involved in, bringing faith-based actors into those spaces and conversations, because that's going to activate them. That's going to mobilise them. They're going to also be able to bring their ideas and their assets and resources to the table that is going to naturally result in better collaboration. Build the church's capacity. And build upon the existing strengths of the church, equipping churches and faith-based actors to better understand these issues around vulnerable children and families, and to provide better and more professional support to them as well. So that means extending opportunities for training to churches and to faith leaders, inviting them to different opportunities. It also might mean providing other resources to churches so that they can enhance the type of informal social support that they can provide to at-risk families in their communities. So making sure that we don't just think about, capacity building and providing resource within the NGO space, but we also think about the implications of that for churches. And pursuing true partnerships. I think this one is really important. We need to foster relationships with churches that are truly mutual and reciprocal and truly respectful relationships. We need to listen, not just see them as, something we can jump on and draw from or leech from, but really understand that we're looking for mutual relationships here. We are looking for respectful relationships that are partnerships here, which means two-way communication. It means listening. It means, not only seeing what the church can do and asking the church, but hearing back from the church their feedback about how, whatever other space we're involved in can be made more conducive to collaboration with the faith-based sector. And celebrating the church. I think we need to see more of the church being celebrated for the role that it plays in the lives of families and communities, honouring the church, affirming their role publicly in front of other sectors, in front of other spaces, because again, that keeps on reinforcing and reaffirming the important role that churches play, even when it's not through the provision of formal services. The important role that churches inherently play in strengthening and supporting families and enabling children to grow up in family-based care. Now, they're just a few thoughts and ideas about strategy, and I'm going to turn, for whatever time we have left, to questions, comments, feedback. Feel free to stand up and share a perspective from your own experiences and works that relates to this topic. So I'll turn it over to the floor. Okay. Any questions, any comments, any suggestions, other experiences? I'm going to put someone on the spot. If you don't volunteer, you know it's coming. Which aspect? Yeah, okay. Sure. Some of this is drawn from the experience, as I said, of working with the ACCI, and that was very much a transitional, an unlearning process, if you think about social change processes. And a lot of that's actually mapped and put into a report that's called Changing Mindsets and Practice, that you can actually download off the ACCI website, and it actually maps better that whole process. It gives you much more information. It's part of a longitudinal study that was done to understand how those change processes happen, and it does show you a bit more about how that inside-out activation and mobilisation and collaboration was developed and fostered, and what the steps we took towards that. And it's not always replicable, but there might be parts of the strategy that you could adapt and whatnot. So that's one resource that I can point you to. It's called Changing Mindsets and Practice. It's on the ACCI website or the connected website, which is connected, as in kinship care. And you can download it from the resource tab there. What about other people in the room? Do others know of resources that you'd like to suggest? That's a shame. Oh. Yeah. Absolutely.
Some countries are more adaptive.
Yeah.
Yep. You know, so like judges like education literacy, spiritual beliefs.
Absolutely.
What were your really tough problems?
It always comes down to the beliefs. If you look at this from a behavioural science or from an anthropology perspective, what you see stems from behaviours that stem from beliefs that stem from worldviews. And the tough issues always sit here at the worldview and the belief level. And if you want to change the outputs, the practices, what you see as an expression, do they care about children? Do they embrace? Do they not? You've got to go back to where does that flow from in the belief system and in the worldview system. And different cultures are going to have different sticking points and different opportunities. And what you look at there is whether or not this issue can be bridged to an aspect of worldview and belief system. There's something that is already there that can be utilised as a bridge that makes a good connection and that will enable people to jump across that divide a bit easier. Or is it a gap? Is it a big black hole and we need to build a bridge? So we need to build, and partly in the ACC we found that was the case, which is why we went back and built a theological framework, because the theological framework at the time was all about orphanages. So we had to rebuild that because we were speaking into a gap, into a black hole. And so going back and assessing where does it stem from, and then how do I utilise those norms of belief and worldview to actually connect to this issue. And if you can find those bridges, that's what's going to make it really easy and conducive. And if you don't, then you know at least you're in that stage of the hard work of building bridges, of building connections. So you're looking at where are they? What's the closest connection, and how do I systematically build from that understanding to where I need to get them to in order to adopt these different practices. So in Cambodia, we saw a lot of issues early on around the church fostering or providing family-based care for children with disabilities or with HIV. And I was really surprised by that initially, simply because I was naive. I went to the church thinking, oh, of course, they're all going to go, yes, we'll take in a child. But they all had the same belief system that stemmed from their culture, which is that these children carry some kind of bad karma. They carry with them a curse, and if they bring them into the family, they may bring also this curse into the family. And there was a belief system that said if you have a child die in your care, you inherit the karma of that child. And if that karma is bad because they were born with HIV or a disability, you are setting yourself up to inherit the bad karma. And so it wasn't until I dug in and went, oh, okay, I get where this is coming from. You address that issue, you create new pathways for people to adopt new behaviours and be more embracing of children with vulnerabilities. Again, that's a culturally specific answer. In Cambodia, again, you look at how does behaviour change happen. In some countries, in Western countries primarily, we actually love innovation. We love a new idea, not because it has any value or merit, just because it's new and shiny. And so if you frame something as a brand new idea in Australia or America, we'll all go, ooh, let's do that. But in an Asian culture, that's not the case. They're traditionalists. And so you don't let go of old ideas easily. And so you actually have to demonstrate this through vicarious learning. So demonstration, not abstract talking, telling people, you have to show it to them. So in Cambodia, one of the ways we actually broke that down was a number of us took these children into our families. I fostered 3 children with HIV, 1 child with another type of a disability, and it was by going to church every week with my foster kids and them seeing, oh my gosh, her arms and legs did not fall off. She wasn't in some awful car accident caused by karma. There were no negative ramifications of her opening up her home to these children that others started to say, okay, maybe this is all right. Maybe this is safe. So vicarious learning or observational learning is a huge part of changing behaviour in traditionalist societies. Innovation is where it sits with more Western types cultures that gravitate to what's new just for the sake of it. Yeah. Other questions, comments? Yes. So again, I think a lot of that's going to be context specific. And what you're pointing to is the same as what we had to do in Australia, which is an unlearning process. And an unlearning process looks like that if you map it as a curve. So it starts with what do I have to unknow, and then how do I build knowledge? If you try to build knowledge in an unlearning process without addressing the unlearning part, you actually end up with roadblocks. Because you're hitting resistance and you can't move past it. Until you help them unlearn, you can't help them learn. And so it's about really helping them understand why that model of care that they have normalised isn't necessarily in the best interest of children. And again, when you're bringing this into a church context or a Christian context, that needs to be grounded in more than just science and whatnot. That needs to be grounded in your theology. And that's where it's so important to dig back into the Bible and go, oh, actually, that's exactly what the Bible affirms. It's family-based care. And so that is what grounds us as Christians. It's the Bible, it's our theology. And so bringing this back is the first part. It's helping them unlearn the theology, relearn the theology. Then they can unlearn the practice and relearn the practice. And once you've got a conceptual openness to this, that's when you need to start working out, is my culture geared towards, this more observational learning? Do we need to model? Now do we need to go into the modelling stage? Do I need to show it to them? Or is it going to be okay to use examples from other countries to get those early adopters on board to start to change? Once you've got your early adopters on board, you tell their story. When you've got someone who's willing to change, now share that story as wide and as far as you can, because that's going to help the others. Most people are going to sit back and watch first. They need to see a live case. And then when they see that it worked and it was successful and it resulted in good outcomes for the families and children, good outcomes for the church, then they'll come on board with you. Does it make sense? Well, how are we going for time? What time does this end? I should know that. I'm supposed to be facilitating. Is it ending at 3? Okay, so we're done? Okay, so we probably need to wrap up because I do have another session to go to. I do have some handouts here. 4 more minutes. Anyone else got any comments? You got 4 minutes. Go for it, people. Any other comments and examples from you guys? Aiming to set an example. Yeah. So to the first question, confession on camera, albeit, I'm not a social worker either. I come from an international development anthropology background and have more, in the latter years studied child protection and whatnot. So yes, these tools are accessible because they were accessible to me as well. And you can just Google asset mapping and you'll come up with a range of tools. You'll want to come up with the ones that are looking at internal asset mapping processes. And I can't remember the websites off the top of my head, but there are a couple that actually have resources for asset mapping that is church-based. And they've got some where you there's a little hand there and you map stuff on your hand, and I don't know, there's like one's heart and one's head and one's something or other. But there's some really accessible tools out there that you can use and facilitate facilitate a workshop or facilitate a mapping session within your church to get that information and then make those connections. So yes, those resources are there and they're readily available. In terms of failed approaches or attempts at leading by example. I think it's a hard question because absolutely it could happen. And I can relate to that more in the context of the community development work. In that, one thing we were really keenly aware of in that context is that families and communities that have had a long-term and historical experience of marginalisation are very sensitive to failure. And you have to be incredibly careful that how you support them in their very first attempt is fail-proof. Because if you set them up to fail in that first attempt, at that point in time they are feeling so insecure and so uncomfortable in even trying something new because they're so worried that all of their previous experiences of feeling out of control and with no hope are going to be reinforced, and they're going to feel let down once again. And so protecting that first initial, attempt or effort is so critical, because when it fails, it reinforces the wrong narratives and it will take you below zero in terms of starting again. And I think the same thing would stand in terms of, trying to model foster care or whatever it might be. So I think it's really important to know that we have to almost, be ready to over-support that case example. And we have to be wise about who is that example as well, particularly if you're trying to model harder cases, children with special needs or disabilities or congenital illnesses and whatnot. You've really got to be wise with who that is and how they are supported. I would say that even in myself being an example, I would say I was underprepared. Thankfully, it didn't fully epically fail, but I would say I was underprepared and I learnt a lot along the way. And so with that knowledge in mind, if I was to do that again and try and set that up as an example in another situation or culture, I would really put a lot more support in place around that family, and backup plans. Always have a plan B. How are you going to rescue this if that gets there? Because it is about that child, but it's also about what that child represents. It's also about all the other children that are standing in line behind that child and who are going to benefit from that child's positive experience. And so feeling the weight of that, and I think that does a lot of things. It helps us to be cautious. It also helps us to lean into God and be really listening to Him in that moment and to set that situation up and to be really led by Him. I think overconfidence is probably one of our biggest enemies in that space. So I probably haven't fully answered your question, but that would be my comment.
To slow ourselves down.
Absolutely. And it pays to test. And again, that's why I think piloting is one of those key steps. You've got to start small, you've got to start safe, you've got to test it, you've got to learn before you scale it. We can't kind of just go out there with this big theory that hasn't been tested in different contexts. And I think the other thing I would say to that is we need to move away as a sector from this concept that there are franchises. Sorry, but there are no franchises. There are no easy wins. Every solution will be context specific. It will work because it is relevant and responsive to the context. If you take it out of that context and plant it somewhere else, it is going to be hit and miss. If it succeeds, it's not because of your brilliance, it's because of luck. And if it fails because the context was too different for the model. So we've got to move away from that concept, and we have got to start not looking at the what, looking at the how. How did they get there? What was that journey? What was their process? How did they evaluate context? How did they make decisions with context in mind to come up with those approaches? That's where the gold in the learning is. It's not in the what, it's in the how. Because we all have to see this come out of our context and communities if it's going to be relevant, if it's going to be sustainable, and if it's going to be impacting, and if it's going to be free from unintended consequences.